So, welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to see all of you and to greet you as the Director of Adult Programs at First Church. And this is part of our series of Date with Death Club, which Jackie has been running very successfully. And so we're so pleased that she can do this, and we have a special guest tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, who is going to introduce our guest.
Hello, everybody. I'm always glad to see you, my dear friends from First Church. It's really great to have these discussions together. I want to welcome all of you to what we call the Date with Death Club. And for those who don't know, that is a non-dogmatic exploration of our mortality. All of the sessions are based on the philosophy that we can live more fully and more meaningfully if we recognize the fact that we are finite and that we will die at some point. I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting by sharing my screen. And what we just discovered in the rehearsal that we did before is that when I share my screen, I cannot see you. So Lillian will be able to see you, and if you want to raise your hand and say something, you can do that. There will be a point that we have some discussion, and I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all and we can talk a little bit. Are we good?
Yeah, good.
All right. So, Date with Death Club. Tonight we're going to be talking about options for dealing with burial. I want to share that this is the I believe eighth in the series that we've been doing. It was developed by a UU minister, Dr. Susan Johnston, and she provides a curriculum and slides and exercises and even jokes to go along with this session. She also is very generous in allowing you to make it your own. You can edit the slides, you can think her jokes are too corny. And these are the previous sessions that we've done. We had the very first one, just getting comfortable talking about death and how that affects how we live. We've talked about how to think about having a good life and what might a good death be for us. In that same vein, we've talked about owning our dying, of letting our family know what we do and don't want in our final days. And we've had 2 sessions on making end-of-life wishes known. We've also had a session on grief and one on near-death experiences and end-of-life visions. And we talked a little bit about the afterlife in that session. So the agenda for tonight is to have a little conversation about our own experience with burials and decisions about that. And we also have a wonderful guest speaker. I've had a couple of conversations with her. Corinne Eliconia has worked at Mount Auburn for a long time. She's a good friend of Jean Mooney. And I'm really grateful to Jean for connecting us and making it possible for Corinne to join us tonight. She has so much experience, and the best thing in her bio that I like is she has a passion about fostering a positive discourse around death and promoting education around end-of-life choices and equity so that everyone can experience a good death. And that is the very philosophy behind the Date with Death Club, the whole thing. We are also going to be talking about the way options for burials are changing and how there are new ideas about how to let go of someone who has died. And then we do hope to have time for questions for Corinne. And we'll do our usual closing. our goals are to learn about some of these new options that are coming about. And to learn about the environmental impact of some of these choices in terms of the disposition of a body. And hopefully we'll have time to think about which options are the best for us. This is just part of our usual group agreements that we make with each other, that we try to listen well and support each other, and try not to correct people or advise people. We want to listen and allow each person to have their own journey. These are all very sensitive issues and they're very personal. So what we see here are the traditional whole body burial and the traditional flame cremation. And here I'd like to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask you, which of those have you had experience with? I will start by talking about the casket. Looks just almost like the one that I just used to bury my mother 3 years ago. Those of you who've been here before know that she lived to be 104, and that she left me very explicit instructions about what to do when she died, including she had picked out the casket, and she told me that it needed to have a spray of greenery with one white rose among the greenery for every member of the family. And she told me exactly how many that was at the time, but the family had grown a little bit since she left those instructions. And that is what I experienced. That's been my experience. I have not had a cremation experience. But let's talk about you. What has been your experience with funerals and burial options with, say, grandparents? Let's start there. Can somebody break the ice? Just unmute yourself and
Okay, Miriam?
I can talk about cremation because I've been through it with both my parents and both my in-laws and other family members. With my parents, who did not belong to any kind of church or synagogue or anything, the family just scattered their ashes on Squibnocket Beach on Martha's Vineyard, where they had a summer house. And for them, that was the right thing. Although when my mother died, Diane Miller was our minister, and she came to visit me, and we talked about, what we were planning. And I said, "Do you have any advice?" And she said, "Just make sure you stand upwind when you scatter the ashes so that they don't blow back on you." With my in-laws, which was just 2 years ago that we buried them, they'd made pre-arrangements with a mortuary down in Delaware where they lived to be cremated, but then they wanted to be buried in a family plot on Cape Cod. And the cemetery, there was one plot for the two of them, which is part of their decision to be cremated because there wasn't room for two caskets. And the cemetery said that we were not allowed to bury them in the cardboard boxes that the ashes come in. It's a very nice cardboard box. It's not, but still, we're not. So I went on Amazon and bought hand engraved mahogany boxes that are designed for this purpose. And
that's interesting.
And that's what we put the ashes in, and they were beautiful. And we had a small ceremony with sort of immediate family. And then my sister-in-law had found a minister to come and say a few words, but it was just the immediate family. And then we went out to lunch afterwards, and the cemetery was happy to put the two mahogany boxes in the ground. And the boxes were not specially lined or anything. So eventually the boxes and the ashes will decompose into the earth, even though the cemetery didn't have an explicit policy on green burial, but we just kind of snuck it in there.
Good, those are very interesting stories. Thank you, Miriam. Someone else?
Devin?
When my father died, he was cremated, and in that cardboard box is a very thick plastic bag. And in that bag is where the ashes are. And we distributed the ashes into several little smaller Ziploc tie bags and gave them all in a gathering up in New Hampshire at a summer camp where we would gather. And all of the grandchildren got a little Ziploc bag. And we all said various important things and remembered him. And he used to win the cannonball contest at the summer camp. And so we had a cannonball in with the ashes in the lake. And it was a very joyous family occasion.
Good. Awesome, Devin. Thank you. Do people have feelings about either one of these? Janet, do you want to speak?
Janet,
Yep.
you're muted.
Unmute. Unmute, yeah.
Yeah, I do have feelings about this, and I'm happy to join you all. I have literally had another engagement for the previous 7 meetings, so I'm very excited to be here. But I do have feelings, and at least for my own body, I want it to be offered into the earth. And I have heard that cremation is very environmentally I don't know if it's damaging, but it's not enhancing, let's put it that way. So yeah, I do have feelings about it. And also we had a nephew, my Godfrey's brother's son, who committed suicide in London, and we went to that funeral. And the process there is to actually watch the body via conveyor belt go into the crematoria, and you can see the glow behind it. It's an extraordinary moment.
Very, and then what?
I think then the family disperses, and when the ashes cool, the family is given the ashes, but you're kind of participating at the moment of the burning, and there was smoke outside. It felt, honestly, to me, it felt kind of Holocausty, but and it was such a sad death for this young man that got amplified, I think, by that process, and I just hadn't expected it. So.
Jean, thank you, Janet. Very interesting.
Thanks, Janet. I guess one of the things I've learned is that about the embalming process is that a casket burial oftentimes involves that, and viewings involve that. And when I did training at the Children's Room, we actually went to a undertaker's basement and learned about the process. And ever since learning about that process, I'm like, ugh. However, that being said, I understand there are situations where people want to see a body because it's a farewell thing. Now, that I had a brother who died by suicide, and he was prepared, and I, got to view him. And oftentimes we go into, services and, wakes and see people open casket. But I do recall going to Lanier. I'm not telling tales out of school, that Lanier had an open casket for Richard Marius in their home, and Richard, I do not believe, was any preparation. And I thought, well, that can actually be done that way. So if circumstances allowed, wow, I'd really prefer to be able to have that type of natural viewing. But I do understand that circumstances and what family sentiments and opportunities to say goodbyes mean to people. But personally, I don't think I want that, for my body. And all of my family members have been cremated, but I did view, my father wanted to view my mother before she was cremated. And so he had an embalming done. So you just have to respect, you know, and she didn't say anything otherwise. So I think those are also important decisions about how you want your body treated before any type of cremation or casket burial or green burial. Thanks.
I think it's a good segue, Jean. It's one of the reasons we have sessions like this, and one of the reasons this one was developed is that in the moment when we're making these decisions, we're usually upset. And it's and we don't have, you know, good sense to even think about what options we have. So tonight we're going to be learning more about what options we have. Thank you all for sharing those stories, and we'll have time for more of that as we move along. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to so some of the options that we'll be hearing about tonight, and maybe some of them not, we can ask questions about them, but you know, I've been hearing about human composting, and open air cremation, which is different than the type that was described here just a few minutes ago. There's also water cremation. There's the idea of full burial at sea, which is one of the, I think that's a Muslim habit. Custom. Whole body donation is also an option, and organ donation, forensic donation, and then green burial. And a lot of people have been asking me what it means to have a green burial. So I'm going to welcome Corinne again and thank her for being here and turn the program over to her.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Jane and Lillian, for inviting me and having me here. I'm very excited to talk with this group. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I guess I want to start off just with a little background on Mount Auburn. So Mount Auburn was founded in 1831, and that makes us a Victorian era cemetery. As you can see from the monumentation in the background, it's marble, it's very ornate. And that's classic of the Victorian style of funerary monuments. We are also the first landscape cemetery in the United States. And so in a way we were one of the first ornamental garden spaces for the public to come and walk and think. And in that way, we kind of catalyzed the parks movement in the late 1800s. So if you could go to the next slide, Jackie. So I just want to say hello and tell you a little bit about me. Here I am in this picture. I'm researching a tour that I gave about flowers on gravestones and what they mean, what they symbolize. So I started at Mount Auburn. Oh, did I hear something? Okay. I started at Mount Auburn in 2017. It was my first job out of college. And I originally started as a green burial scout. So essentially, I was a volunteer and I went out on the grounds and I was looking for places in between our old lots where we could put natural burials. And at the time, our natural burial program was very new. So we were developing new spaces for people to purchase. I later then went on to work at the crematory. So I was processing cremation paperwork, I was processing burial paperwork, and I was also I was actually Mount Auburn's first female crematory operator. And so I got certified to do that, and I worked in the crematory for a little bit. Now I do something very different. I'm part of the visitor services team. And so I talk a lot to groups like this, and I try to educate them on end of life issues and make sure that the people that are coming to Mount Auburn and looking for different burial options, they have the best information that they can have. I also work on a lot of tours, as is pictured here, because we are a historic cemetery. We have a lot of notable people buried here. And this being a UU group, I don't know if you know, but we have a lot of UU ministers buried at the cemetery. For example, we have one of your founders, William Ellery Channing, is buried at the cemetery, as well as a minister, Hosea Ballou. So if those are any familiar names to you, if you have ever been to the cemetery, you can visit them. Anyway, we can get to the meat and potatoes of the talk, which is essentially going into each type of burial option. Or I shouldn't say each type, but the main ones that are the most popular. And I was going to explain a little bit about what they look like, especially at Mount Auburn, because that's what I know the most about. But yes, Jackie, if you could advance to the next slide. Oh, yes. This is just a really beautiful engraving. And I think it really captures Mount Auburn as it's an active burial place, but it's also much more than that. It's a Mass Audubon important bird area. It's a 501c13. So that's part of the group that I work at, which is the Friends of Mount Auburn, which is a nonprofit educational trust. And it really is a vibrant cultural institution and urban green space. Jackie, could I have the next slide? So first, one back, there we go. First, I'd love to start off talking about conventional burial, which is the term that we use at Mount Auburn to describe this type of burial. And essentially it's what a lot of people in our generation and beyond think about when they think about being buried at a cemetery. So there's a casket as opposed to a coffin, and a casket is rectangular as opposed to a toe pincher like a coffin is. There's turf greens that are involved, as you can see in this picture here. There's a mechanical lowering device, which is the piece of metal that you see at the foot of the casket. And generally, and at Mount Auburn this is true, they are double depth, which means the holes that are dug are double the depth so that you can fit two caskets on top of each other. So one grave fits two people. Often the body is embalmed in these cases, but it is not always the case. And often the cemetery requires the use of a concrete vault for these burials. So we do require that for these burials at Mount Auburn. I think most other cemeteries do as well, but you can find some cemeteries that will not require the use, and maybe mark it as a preference. So at Mount Auburn, we generally mark these traditional burials with a flush monument. And what that means is that the monument is flat to the ground. So we don't really offer a whole lot of upright monumentation anymore. And that's for a lot of different reasons, but the main ones are environmental and also just a factor of space in the landscape. Jackie, if you could go to the next slide. So, working at a cemetery, we deal mostly with people who are looking for final disposition. And what that means is it's the burial as opposed to the act of which like cremation is an act, yet afterwards you're left with the ashes, and your decision on what to do with the ashes is the final disposition of the person. And so cremation is not necessarily final disposition, but rather a description of an act. And so this is our crematory. This is where I worked for a time. And generally in the crematory, the bodies are unembalmed and they come in cardboard boxes that we call air trays. So there's usually not a casket, although sometimes we do get caskets, say if a family wanted a viewing of the body, sometimes we would get caskets in that case. For our retorts, and a retort is the machine that you see here, the metal square on the wall. That's the chamber where the body is cremated. That process takes about 1 to 3 hours, and that's a very good track record because a lot of older machines that are less fuel efficient take many more hours than that to do one cremation. So some cremated remains are given back to the family in urns, and we do the processing of those cremated remains in the crematory. Sometimes they are in cardboard boxes, which we heard a little bit about when we were sharing our cremation experiences earlier. But it's not always the case. Did somebody say something? Okay, thanks. This is cremation burial. So as I was saying before about final disposition versus the act of cremation, this is one of the options of final disposition for cremated remains. So you can scatter the remains, you can keep the remains at home, or you can choose to bury them in a cemetery like Mount Auburn. And so often we have cremated remains that are buried in an urn or a cardboard box. In other locations of the cemetery, we allow that for cremated remains to be poured directly into the earth. So there's no need for a vessel of any kind. They can be kind of mixed into the compost and landscape itself. And again, as I mentioned, many loved ones, they choose to keep their cremated remains at home, or they choose to scatter them in a location that's important to them. At Mount Auburn, if you do choose to bury an urn or a cardboard box of cremated remains, they are marked by a flush marker. So again, that's the marker that's flat to the ground. Or we offer shared memorialization, which is where you share a upright monument or a flat monument with many other people and have your name and dates engraved into that monument. Another option for cremated remains is that they can be inurned in a columbarium, which is it's a structure, so it's a building, and you can walk into it and see the walls of the urns or the cremated remains in the wall. Sometimes families like to add mementos from their loved ones when they have space in a columbarium, and other times it's just a name that is a plaque on the wall. Could I have the next slide, please? And then there's natural burial. So this is it's always funny to me to describe natural burial because I think when most people haven't heard of it before, they tend to go, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, I thought that's what we were already doing. And it is what we were already doing for many, many years. In fact, most of the bodies that were buried at Mount Auburn in its founding, they were buried naturally. There was no embalming. There was no vault or concrete or anything like that. And so it's kind of in a way going back to the way things were before the 1950s, and burial culture shifted quite a bit. And it should be noted too that embalming is an ancient practice. For example, we know of the embalming that the ancient Egyptian cultures did, but the way that we know embalming today really started with the Civil War and how they wanted to preserve the bodies of the soldiers that died in the South for transport to the North for their families. And even more so, it's become, I think, more industrialized over the past 100 years. And it really changed from that original purpose to kind of something that we think of as default. So for our natural burials, which it's not the same in every cemetery that you go to, but for ours, we require that the body is unembalmed and that it comes in a biodegradable container, such as a plain pine box, a shroud, or a wicker coffin, essentially something that can decompose entirely with the body and leave no trace. We also require that there is no concrete vault for these graves, so they're not allowed to have one. And these graves are hand dug, and they're about 4 feet deep. And that's important because if you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint, you also have to think about the gasoline and diesel fuel that's being used by the backhoes to dig the graves. So these graves are hand dug, and they're also less deep than our conventional graves. And that's so that the soil is more aerated and therefore the body can decompose into the earth a little easier. We also don't allow any turf. Oh, did somebody say something? Okay. We also don't allow any turf greens to be used at natural burial graves. And this is, a small thing, but it does help the carbon footprint when we have to purchase less of the plastic turf for these graves. And also the lowering device is different than a conventional burial. So it's lowered by hand and often is lowered by the family themselves should they decide that that's what they want to do. And for us, natural burials are often not memorialized, so we don't have a marker for the graves. Sometimes we'll have a nearby tree plaque with the person's name on it, or we'll have a nearby shared memorial. But strangely enough, one of the most carbon-rich factors of burial is monumentation and also land use. And I think that often gets overlooked a lot. And I think it's been a difficult hurdle to get over because people really like the idea of having a monument to their legacy, even people who are environmentally conscious. And so we always say that the most green option is to not have a memorial. And so that's the majority of the natural burial graves that we sell. Jackie, could I have the next slide? So now we're getting into territory where these are much newer processes that are actually not yet legal in Massachusetts. So Mount Auburn doesn't offer these dispositions, and neither does any other crematory or cemetery or funeral home in Massachusetts because it has not been passed yet. There is legislation. It's Representative Higgins' bill that's going through the Massachusetts State House. I think it's in committee, like health committee right now. And it's looking to legalize this process, alkaline hydrolysis, as well as natural organic reduction, which I'll talk about next, but that's human composting. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction, even though these options are not yet available to us in Massachusetts. So alkaline hydrolysis is also known as water cremation or aquamation. And essentially, it's the dissolution of the body in an alkaline solution and water. So I think it's about 95% water and 5% alkalis. And the body and the solution are poured into this tank. And as you see, it kind of pivots around. And when it pivots around, everything is kind of mixed together and the body begins to dissolve. So the body is processed, and what's left on the other side, the byproduct, is sterile effluent, which is dumped into the water system, and bone fragments. And the bone fragments resemble cremated remains as if it were cremated by fire. And so these bone fragments are processed and they're returned to the family, and they look almost identical to cremated remains, which you can do as you wish. You can bury them in a cemetery, you can scatter them, you can keep them at home. Could I have the next slide? And this is natural organic reduction. So, oops,
Sorry.
thanks. So this is also known as human composting, recomposition, terramation, NOR. There's a lot of different names for it. I think they got a little scared by the human composting name. And again, this is something that's not yet legal in Massachusetts, but we're working on legalizing it. And I believe in the current bill that they have going through the State House, it would leave natural organic reduction and alkaline hydrolysis to the cemeteries to conduct, just like the cemeteries are doing cremations in Massachusetts. So The body is placed into a container with organic materials such as straw and wood chips. And then the body is allowed to decompose as a steady supply of air is piped into the vessel. And also, so you see the body here is covered with the organic material, and it goes into that little pod. And that pod also rotates kind of like your composter would for your garden. So you're mixing around the oxygen, you're mixing around all of the organic material, and you're allowing the body to decompose in ideal conditions. And so the bones are then separated from the soil because, again, you have a whole human skeleton in that pile of compost, and the bone fragments are pulverized essentially and processed similar to the way they are with cremated remains. And then their soil and the bone fragments are recombined and placed into a curing vessel. And this is, again, very similar to how you would cure compost for your garden. And then the result after all of this is a very uniform mixture, about 1 cubic yard. So that's a lot of compost. And again, the process takes about 4 to 6 weeks. One of the concerns that a lot of people have with the idea of composting is just how long it takes for people to get the final disposition of their loved one, and also the amount of space and materials that it requires to conduct. And so that's something that's being discussed. This photo is actually from a company out in Washington where the process is legal, called Recompose. There are a lot of different places now that offer it and have legalized the process. However, very few of them actually have facilities that are up and running. For example, I believe California has legalized the process, but they don't have any practitioners yet. So, excuse me. Washington State is one of the first to actually offer the process, and people can buy it and go through with it. And so, yeah, it's another option that we hope is coming to Massachusetts soon. Could I have the next slide? So as part of my work, and one of the things I'm very excited about, we actually ordered a life cycle assessment on the final disposition and cremation at Mount Auburn specifically. So what a life cycle assessment is essentially, it's carbon footprinting, but it's a little bit more than that. So you're measuring the carbon footprint as well as the land usage, the water usage, of the various offerings that we have at Mount Auburn. So for the scope of our study, we decided to focus on natural burial, cremation burial, conventional burial, and cremation itself. And so if you go to the next slide, and this is still a work in progress, but I thought this group might be curious, so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about. We kind of created this analysis pathway of how we're going to actually think about how to begin to quantify the environmental impact of all of these different things. Because I think a lot of people think about embalming as a big, I guess, adder of pollution, which is true, but there's also a bunch of other things that we don't necessarily think about when quantifying the environmental impact of embalming a body. For example, there's transportation that we have to consider. There's the grave opening, which again, I mentioned earlier, requires a backhoe that runs on diesel engine or diesel fuel, sorry. There's the grave closing, and then there's the cemetery maintenance. So we have lawnmowers going all the time to make sure that the graves are nice and neat and clean. And then there's the monument manufacturing, which is a whole nother area that's really hard to quantify. If you're getting, local stone, or are you getting it from far away? How is it being transported? How is it being manufactured? What does that look like in impact to human health of the people who are mining for these materials? So there's a lot to think about that we don't necessarily think about. And so I'm really excited for the results of this study, and hopefully, if we get funding to do the peer review, we'll be able to share that with the public. But I think this might be the end of my slides. Is there another one after this? Oh, yes, more to come. So again, yeah, we're working on this study. I'm very excited about it. It's made me think about a lot of things that I hadn't thought about before. And I would really love to talk with you all and answer any questions. That was kind of a fast-paced crash course in final disposition. So I'm sure that you have questions, and again, happy to answer them. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinne. I think that was fast and informative and very interesting. A lot of things that I had never heard of or thought of. So I want to open the floor now to questions. Please sort of raise your hand, and maybe I see Miriam, you have your hand up.
Well, it's just a quick question about what you said about the monuments adding to the carbon impact. Can you talk about the difference between a vertical monument of like of granite or stone and then the flat plaque? What is the relative impact of each of those?
So from our like preliminary looking at it, the upright monuments, the majority of their material is actually below the earth. So we have to have a huge poured foundation of concrete below every upright marker to make sure that they're structurally sound and will remain upright and won't just fall on anybody. And so that's where the majority of the material is, and where you add the most to the carbon footprint. Just getting that material. The flush markers, they don't require a foundation because again, they're not upright. And so you're actually, by just looking at them, it might not seem like you're adding a ton of material, but because you don't have that foundation below, that's the reason why it's so significant.
Deb, you had your hand up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this program. Nice to meet you virtually, Ms. Kryn. Great presentation. So when we're talking about, I have a couple questions for you, and I'll probably give them to you all at once. So green burial, I didn't realize there were so many variations on green burial. And so your natural burial and your alkaline and your organic are all under green? Would that be fair to say?
I would say those are the environmentally conscious options. I think that the way that, at least in the industry, the way we've defined green burial is more of the body whole earth, like instead of the process of natural organic reduction or alkaline hydrolysis, although those are environmentally green options that you can have. I think that when most people talk about green burial, they're referring to that very like simplified conventional burial.
There was a green burial program that I attended a long time ago, and it's where the body was wrapped in a gauze and maybe buried out in the woods or something, but you needed to have a connection to a church or someone who was maybe authorized to be able to conduct that. Are you familiar with that at all?
A few different things I'm thinking of. One, that it could be a private burial ground connected to a church, similar to like an old family burial ground. Another option I'm thinking of is that it could be a conservation burial, which is a burial that happens on conservation land so as to protect the land from development. I don't know if those ring a bell.
It could have been. I mean, it was a bit ago, which totally changed my mind into how, because I don't want anybody to see me dead. I want you to remember that we're cracking up laughing the whole time. So you know, that's how I would like to have people remember me. And then I guess my last question, or at least for right now, is it possible to determine DNA from ashes in the cremation process? I guess the bone maybe that's left, but is,
Yes, I think it is. It's from, I could be wrong about this. I'm not a forensic person, but I have the feeling that isn't bone DNA somehow different than like a live sample of hair, or I feel like there's less information in it. For that reason, we go through a rigorous process before we of validating cause of death and identity before we cremate anybody, because it's considered a permanent irreversible thing. So we can go and get forensic data from cremated remains.
There is a couple of questions in the chat by Catherine Stahlberg that I'll read out. How many green burials sites are there now at Mount Auburn? What do they cost? And could a spouse's ashes be put on top of the body in a box?
That's a great question. For the green burial inventory that we have, I believe we have available inventory, although I know there is a waiting list for like a sales appointment because we have such a high demand for those spaces. What they cost, I know that changes year to year, and I'm not on the sales team, but the last time that I checked, it was around $10,000 for a plot. And could a spouse's ashes be put on top of the body in a box? I think that, and again, I don't want to say anything that the sales team would be mad at me for, but I think that if you have, if the ashes are in a decomposable box, that it would be okay.
Eleanor, you had a question.
Am I off mute? You can hear me?
You are.
So question about, what you do about, someone who has an implantable device, you know, after they die, and some of these have lithium batteries, for example. So do they get removed by, who removes them, or do they not get removed? Because some of these are, you know,
If
I
you're
wonder what would happen to them when the rest of the body decomposes.
if you're thinking of pacemakers specifically, the pacemakers are removed by a funeral director before the body gets to the crematory, and that is because because of the batteries, they will explode in the retort chamber.
Right.
And so for the safety of everyone at the crematory, we make sure that happens beforehand. If you're thinking about things like hip implants, dental implants, those remain. Yeah, those remain in the body and are separated from the cremated remains before they are returned to the family.
Yeah, well, there are some other kinds of implantable pumps that aren't defibrillators and that. I guess the family would just need to notify the funeral director of the
Yeah.
presence of it, because there can be in various locations. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Jean?
Well, just to follow up on Eleanor's question, so if there was a device such as that, could you do a natural burial? Would anything of that nature have to be removed that would be considered not environmentally sound for a natural burial, which would then require someone at a funeral home to intervene in the body? So, you know, there's the question of trying to have the least intervention, you know, possible, you know, from when a death occurs. And I mean, that's a whole nother discussion about that convention, which I find confusing in itself, of who to call and what you do and don't have to do. Maybe you know the answer to that, Corinne. But anyway, regardless, question number one is, anything like that as Eleanor's described, would they have to be removed to classify for a natural burial?
So at Mount Auburn, we don't require that for natural burials. This is one of the trickier parts about like how green is the burial. Humans have a lot of stuff in them, like implants, and I think so. I just recently went through chemo, and I was thinking, you know, if I died and they buried me, my body would be full of poison. And does that just go into the ground? And I think that, again, humans are kind of complicated creatures, and we have microplastics in us, and you know, all these things. So how green a burial can be is kind of arbitrary in a sense, depending on the person.
Any other questions? Yes, Janet, I see your hand, and I see you, Susan. Janet?
Thank you. And again, echoing what everybody else has said, it's just so lovely to have you here and presenting some of these options, which I have to say, a few looked pretty space age there. Does Mount Auburn act as a funeral director? I mean, I'm trying to kind of get an overall idea of the process, and like if I were to die tomorrow, could Godfrey call Mount Auburn Cemetery and basically engage them to handle all the necessary aspects of disposing of a body?
Well, you're certainly always welcome to call, although Mount Auburn does not act as a funeral director. Essentially, this is a little bit unique for people in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, I think, is one of 10 or so states where you're actually legally prohibited from, as a cemetery, as being a funeral director. So say you go to California, what you'll find there is that there's cemeteries that are also crematories that also offer funeral director services. And there's a lot of states like that. But in Massachusetts, funeral directors actually have to operate on their own outside of the cemetery and crematory business. And then, strangely enough, crematories have to be tied to cemeteries in the legal code. And so that's why Mount Auburn has a crematory, but we're not a funeral home, essentially. And we do work with funeral directors that are local. One of the things, if you were to call Mount Auburn and ask for information, we could direct you to various local funeral homes that we work with. Say if being cremated specifically at Mount Auburn was something that you wanted, that then we could work with the funeral home that you've chosen to make sure that your body is brought there to Mount Auburn's crematory to be cremated. But yeah, it's a little curious in Massachusetts. I actually like that law. I think that it's, you know, it's a little old-fashioned at this point, but I think it does prevent a lot of conflict of interest in terms of funeral directors trying to upsell their own services to their clients. Say, if you have your funeral there, you get a discount on purchasing a plot or something like that, or vice versa.
Thank you.
Susan? You're muted, Susan.
Raise your hand.
I did.
You have to unmute.
Susan,
You're still muted.
You could say something now.
Anybody else have a question while Susan works on this? Okay, Louise, I don't know who you are.
Yeah, this is Godfrey.
Oh, Godfrey.
Yeah, hi. I'm just in a different environment tonight. That's
Okay.
great. So love the presentation.
We worked it out.
Yeah, it's okay. I was just at a committee meeting with Louise. That's why I'm here at church. So my question is about sort of the mysteries of cremation. So you see the coffin go in, as Janet explained. We saw that in gory detail for our nephew. And then at the end, you get like this tiny little container of ashes. What happens to all the rest of the ashes, and how much of those are actually human remains?
That's a great question. I definitely can't say in terms of percentages, but what I can say is that of course, it will depend on whether you're also burning a casket or if it's just a cardboard box. So with a cardboard box, there's just less material that's left at the end. And honestly, all of the flesh and cardboard is burned away entirely, and what's left is really just the bone fragments of the individual, and those bone fragments are then raked out of the retort, and they're put into a device that's called the cremulator. And essentially what that is it's a processing machine that makes it so that the cremated remains are uniform. And not every country does this. In fact, in Japan, if you were to get a cremation, you would not be put in the cremulator. It would just be the bone fragments in an urn, and that's just part of the cultural differences. Does that answer your question okay?
I'm just wondering, is there sort of significant amount of remains that's left over after you've raked it out and put it in, the box for the family?
I wouldn't say it's a significant amount. Of course, you can't get every single speck of dust out of the retort, but we do the best that we can to clean everything very thoroughly in between cremations.
Great, thank you. That does answer the question.
Susan.
Thank you for your patience. I have two different sort of sets of questions. The first is for natural burial. How long does it take for a body to decompose? And will those grave sites be reused at some point?
That's a really great question. So in terms of the decomposition, it's a little bit different for everybody, just depending on the weather, the amount of air that is able to get into the grave for decomposition. So we say that in about 3 months, all of the organic material is broken down at about 3 feet in depth. And the deeper you go, the longer that it takes to decompose. I think by about 2 years, in an ideal environment, there's only bone fragments left of the body at a 3-foot depth. As for your second question, funny enough, Mount Auburn actually invented the term in the US called perpetual care, which is the idea that we will take care of your grave in perpetuity forever. And so what that meant, and what that was really changing of the cultural time, was that the graves weren't reused, and usually they were reused. In Europe, they still reuse graves, and the bones are put into ossuaries. And even in New Orleans, this is a practice where they, on a year and a day, they'll clean out the mausoleum and they'll put the bones in an ossuary and they'll reuse the graves. At Mount Auburn, we do not reuse our graves, although I think there is a discussion to be had about if we really want to talk about environmentalism and sustainability, especially the sustainability of our landscape, we have to think about how entropy can't can only go so far in this closed system.
Thank you. My other question was about, let me see if I can read it. If there are any restrictions on scattering cremains and also the cost of cremation.
So there are restrictions on the scattering of cremated remains. And I think as a representative of Mount Auburn, I have to tell you that you have to get a license to scatter cremated remains. But as a person, I would say that that is rarely the case, that people do get that license to do so. As for the price of cremation, I do not believe that there's any law that requires a certain pricing on cremation. Or prevents it from getting so high. What I do know is that by law, funeral homes are required to offer what's called a direct cremation, which is always the cheapest option on their list of services. And what a direct cremation essentially is there's no viewing, there's no urn services. There's no memorial service. It's just the person's picked up from the hospital or from your home or wherever they died. They're sent to the crematory, they're cremated, and the ashes are returned to you. There's no other bells and whistles on the process. And that's legally required that every funeral home offer that base of services. And generally, that's the lowest price.
And do you have any sense at all of the price of or the range of price on that service?
Yes, I think the last time I checked, it was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500, depending on the funeral home you went to.
Thank you.
Okay, did I see another hand up? Yes, Kathy.
Yes, thank you, Corinne, for a thoughtful presentation. Just a little more about restrictions, water restrictions for dispersing ashes in water. I have in my basement a Mount Auburn cemetery bag with the remains of a friend who wanted to be, we're looking for somewhere on the Cape to scatter her ashes. And I think that there are restrictions with regard to beaches and, bodies of water. Thank you.
Yes, there are. I personally wish it wasn't the case, but yeah, there's permitting required also for burial at sea. There's a charter necessity and everything like that. I mean, just speaking in my personal experience, I've personally scattered my loved one's remains without a permit. Arrest me. I don't know. Yeah, but I can tell you that legally, yes, there are permitting requirements.
Okay, I see you, Susan. I'm waiting to see if Rick has a question. Let's go with someone who hasn't had a chance yet, and then we'll get to you, Susan. Go ahead, Rick.
Hi. So Corinne, thank you very much. Lillian, thank you very much for making this possible, and especially Jackie for the years of this. This is like more of a comment and concern. It's like a big picture and sort of my hope for the future. I'm taken back by the fact that it seems like Massachusetts is behind on some of the issues that we've talked about tonight and talked about earlier. Especially the death with dignity, which was discussed in an earlier segment, maybe in the first year, which my brother in California was fortunately able to avail himself of that. And his ashes were sent to me, and I just distributed them in New Hampshire at our cabin because he was an outdoor person. So my hope, I guess, Jackie, I'll sort of put this on you, is that there be a future session to look at how can we be politically engaged so that all of us have the choices that we want with regards to death with dignity, natural organic reduction, which I guess is now not an option in Massachusetts. Thank you for everything you've done, but that's my hope for the future.
Hey, thank you, Rick.
I very much agree with your thought process. Massachusetts laws on burial and cremation are absolutely draconian, and they just haven't been updated in a very long time. And I think we still deal with a lot of opposition. I testified in support of the bill to legalize natural organic reduction. and alkaline hydrolysis, and there was a lot of people who were opposing that bill as well. So yeah, I hope that it's enough to pass and to enact.
Okay, I see your hand, Sam. Susan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, this is again a quick follow-up. So we've talked about the environmental negatives about cremation, but the actual cremated remains, does scattering them have a negative environmental impact in any way?
Yes, although it can be very small or very large. Essentially, if you have a scattering grounds, which is where cremated remains are continually scattered over and over and over again. This is often called a scatter garden. You're increasing the pH of the soil because what cremated remains essentially are is carbon and salt. Which is what's left over after the body it has been cremated. And so you're kind of tinkering with the biology there a little bit when you're mixing in so much cremated remains into soil. If you're scattering cremated remains at your at the summer camp you grew up going to, this is not really a factor that you should consider.
What about in water, in oceans and lakes?
Yeah, I'm sure that enough of it, it's not necessarily a good thing to put in the ocean, or on the grounds in general, but I think in terms of the amount of waste that we produce in general, it's one of the more negligible things.
Thank you.
Sam?
I'm really curious about the opposition that when you were testifying that you got. It made me think of blue laws and all the pushbacks. So people could buy things on Sundays, or even alcohol and the distribution of alcohol. And much of that was driven by religious concerns. Is this driven, the opposition, is it driven by religious groups? Is it, and what's their argument?
Yes, it is generally religious groups. Strangely enough, the Funeral Directors Association doesn't support it because it doesn't leave it in their jurisdiction. It leaves it in the cemetery's jurisdiction. So there's that complication for them. But the main opposition, at least in the public, is a religious concern. And generally what we see, we did a little brief survey and study of the different factions, and the main opposition is coming from the Catholics in Boston.
Well, that's pretty specific. Okay, Jean, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I want to get back to a logistics here. So if you have a sudden death, unexpected death, either in a home or a hospital situation, and let's say that's in Belmont, do you normally have a body transported? Okay, let's send it to Brown and Sons Funeral Home or whatever, or the body is sent somewhere for a certain amount of time, and then you have to decide, well, gee, I didn't do my pre-purchase arrangement at Mount Auburn. So how does that impact your time frame on how you're doing things if you haven't prepared? So where does the body go if the police show up and it's like, yes, we have to take this body away? I mean, I took care of, my mother both my parents died in the hospital. We already made plans because they had been dying. So we had those arrangements because of their situation. But there are other situations where you're not prepared, for that. And I'm trying to understand the logistics of how that works with, local, public safety, the funeral directors, and then a cemetery.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. I've never really considered it of so if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying what happens if someone dies suddenly or violently and the police get involved and take the body for forensic examination or something like that?
or not even necessarily for, you know, forensics. I don't know if there's a body who died, that someone who dies at home, if it has to go to a morgue, or if they, in Belmont, maybe you could just, I should just call the chief of police and ask them their protocol.
Mhm.
But I don't know how long a body then stays at a funeral home before, you know, the other arrangements are made, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a funeral director, so I can't say for certain about their operations. I guess what I can talk about when we receive bodies for cremation, a lot of times they are directly from a hospital. So essentially the family has arranged for the funeral director to pick up the body from the hospital morgue, and drive it to the crematory. And in that case, there's actually another Massachusetts law is that we have a 48-hour waiting period. And that is so that the medical examiner can come and identify the body and determine the cause of death. And this is a mandatory waiting period before we're allowed to cremate the body. And so that does help in terms of forensic investigation, just to make sure that we're not cremating anybody that they would otherwise think of as a suspicious death or anything like that. I know that if you die at home, you don't have to call a funeral director immediately. It's not an emergency in the sense of like you're doing something wrong if you spend more time with the body or prep the body yourself. Home funerals are valid, and I've been to a few, and they're really touching and lovely when the family cares for the body themselves. And a lot of times you don't need to contact a funeral. You can arrange a funeral director. You can arrange for the transport of the body to the cemetery or crematory yourself. It does involve a lot of paperwork, and it's kind of an annoying bureaucracy to go up against, which is why a lot of families choose to contact funeral directors. But yeah.
Does that, if a body goes from the hospital to the cemetery, is that 48 hours? Does that, the person comes to the crematorium to do that? That's what I thought.
That's the 48-hour waiting period starts when they arrive.
Wow, thank you.
Okay, you've asked some really, really good
I
questions.
saw Anne's hand there.
Oh, Anne, go ahead. Thank you.
I just had a logistical question as well in regard to organ donation. If would the funeral director handle all the coordination so that the body they would have the body delivered to Mount Auburn after all of that has happened? Is that how it usually works?
Yes, I believe so. I believe if you're working in tandem with, say, Harvard Medical School or something like that, they would be heavily involved in the arrangements with the funeral director, because they would receive your body first. They would collect the organs that are for donation or for study, and then they would return the body to the funeral director to prepare it for final disposition.
Thank you for this.
Wow, things you never thought of.
Maybe we need to have a funeral director.
Oh, it's a good follow-up. Yeah, I was thinking that. You'd get a different perspective. Yes, I see you, Paul. Go ahead, and then Eleanor.
Well, I realized that I had learned a lot more about green burials, and the question I really have, and it was very interesting that Corinne, thank you very much for mentioning this. It sounds like in Massachusetts, obviously besides Mount Auburn Cemetery, there are possibilities for places to do green burials, and some of them involve conservation land. So what really I'm trying to get at is some of us have sort of gone through a lot of different thought processes, but we'd like to find a place that allows green burials with the minimum amount of fuss. Okay, and sort of, I'm interested, I don't expect you to necessarily be a spokesperson for what those are, but it was really interesting that you mentioned conservation land, and there might be other possibilities as well, other than cemeteries that happen to allow green burials.
Yeah, there's an organization you should look into. It's called there's kind of two groups. There's the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Eastern Massachusetts, and they're very active and passionate about kind of the consumer side of funerals. They're also very passionate about green burials. And then there's a group that's called the Southeast Pine Barrens Conservation Land, and I believe that's right in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They're trying to turn the Southeast Pine Barrens Conservation Land into a conservation burial ground. And I greatly support their effort. I think that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Eleanor?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, Corinne just sort of touched on this, but somebody has to fill out a death certificate. And so, medical examiners, my experience in Massachusetts, very rarely take jurisdiction of a case. It has to be really egregiously, suspicious for unnatural death for them to do that. And so, hospice nurses, for example, there are, people who can fill them out. But my understanding is that a hospital, if somebody dies in a hospital, the hospital morgue won't release the body until the death certificate is completed. There does need to be a death certificate before you can cremate or bury or do anything else. It's part of the, way our population is followed from birth to death. But I just wanted to mention that. Having been, I would say, the victim of 2 a.m. calls to fill out death certificates of people that I've never met, I can tell you that it's paperwork that has to be done.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end here. Jackie, do you want to take over for?
So I want to know just briefly, did anybody come in with preconceived notions of what they thought they might want to do as their own final disposition, to use the words of Corinne? And have anybody changed their mind?
Yes, Janet and Susan?
I came in thinking I want to rot. I really want things to grow from my decomposition. And I resonated with Jean, what you said about wanting minimal, invasive procedures done to a body. I felt that very strongly with my mother. I felt very protective of her body, and I didn't like the idea of having her embalmed, and she didn't want an open casket, and it worked out beautifully, actually. But I really, it feels like a waste of all this fat and stuff that I, have grown over these years, not to allow the soil to have it. I don't want to be wasteful with a nice fat resource here.
Susan, did you have anything to add to that? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Okay, unmute, Susan.
Deb, go ahead.
I think it's just very interesting to start thinking about the fact that there are options to consider. I mean, cremation is the only one I've heard mentioned around me before, and it's worth thinking about the fact that there are other options.
Yep. Anyone else? Final words?
I love knowing there are many options, and I guess that's what happens when time goes by and something catches on. And I mean, the last I heard really was of the swaddling of the linen around you. So it's really nice to know the options are there. It's really wonderful to know that we have such a lovely cemetery and place for people to go and contemplate that we could call home or not, or scatter them wherever. So thank you. It came with an idea, and you made it stronger. I appreciate it.
Catherine, I saw your hand.
Thanks.
My dilemma is that I love Mount Auburn. I've been walking there since, I could stick Gabriel in a backpack and walk around with Nathaniel. And I did go to a green burial there before the pandemic, and it was beautiful. The woman was tightly wrapped in a blue silk shroud, and it looked like a body. I mean, here was Lynn's body being put in the ground. So I like that idea, but I also have 4 or 5 generations of moons in a cemetery in Pennsylvania where I could be buried with my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents. But my kids, not that we're the type of people who visit cemeteries, but they're not going to Pennsylvania to visit the gravesite. So, and then there are 10 generations of moons in a Quaker cemetery that's pretty full up. I'm not sure I have that option, but I wouldn't choose that anyway. But I like the idea of my body just being in the ground and ideally plant a tree on top of me.
Kathleen?
So forgive me for not having my camera on. I'm status post spine surgery, and this is not a pretty thing to look at. This whole session has been fascinating for me, and I'm very glad that that Rick got me access to y'all. As a nurse, I just want to make a pitch for donation, tissue and organ donation. And the New England Donor Services is notified every time that there is a death or even a near death in a hospital that allows them to reach out to family members. And when we think about what's the best thing for our bodies after death, I'd like to make a pitch for the best thing that we can do with our bodies after death is to give something to another person. And that would be organ or tissue donation.
Thank you.
All right, I want to, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you all for being here. I'm so grateful to all of you for your open-mindedness, for your curiosity, and for your shared experiences and stories. It's been a really meaningful night for me. And I want to talk about just briefly the next session we're planning for next fall is on death and poetry. And I'm going to be doing that with Peter Guthrie, who we've already started talking about it. It's a night of reading really accessible poems about our mortality and discussing what they mean and how they affect us. So I hope you all stay tuned for that. You'll hear more about it in the fall. And thank you, Corinne, so much for this incredible presentation, sharing both the facts and the figures, but also your own personal experiences and your knowledge of these issues. We thank you so much. It's been great to work with you. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you all so much. I had a wonderful time. This is a great group, and yeah, I hope to hear from you all again.
All right. Well, thank you all, and good